Good morning, everybody. My name is Cody Norred. I am the Director of Programs and Policy at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, and you're tuning in to our next episode of Coffee and Something Stronger, a coffee chat style show where we talk about the intersections of theology, environmental justice, climate change, and of course, with the backdrop of coronavirus. We've been talking with different faith leaders, academics, and practitioners from across the state and across the Southeast. And this morning, I'm very excited because we have a good friend of Gipple and a friend of mine, Rabbi Lawrence Rosenthal, who is the senior rabbi at Ahavat Achim Synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia, or AA Synagogue, and is also the president of the Atlanta Rabbinical Society. And I'm so grateful that you are here with us this morning. Rabbi Lawrence, if you want to say hello and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came to be a rabbi and your interest in the environment.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I'm really honored to be on this platform and be able to share some thoughts and some ideas and a little bit about myself and get to know this community a little bit more. So my name is Lawrence Rosenthal. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. The question that came about how did I become a rabbi was really tied into a connection with people. It's really been a very important part of my life. When I was in college, I started to focus on people. I was a psychology major. Got a little off track with the focus on neuropsychology. I guess that's a little bit more of like kind of micromanaging, getting to know people on a very, very micro level. But I was always in that process really trying to understand like the human condition, like what it was like to be a person, what it was like to be in community and relationship. And I really felt that as an academic field, psychology would be the way to go. But there was just something missing during it. I really loved my course study, but there was something missing in the whole practice. And during that time, I was becoming more observant Jewishly. I was starting to look at keeping kosher, which I know is something we're going to talk about a little bit later. And I was finding a spiritual practice of going to synagogue on a regular basis, study, things like that. And right around the same time, I was really questioning whether psychology was the thing for me and really finding a lot of meaning in my Jewish life. But the idea of becoming a rabbi was ridiculous. Being a rabbi is not a real job. I mean, who does that for a living? Definitely not a good Jewish boy, that's for sure. And so I ended up continuing in psychology. And actually, after college, I worked in a research laboratory studying the effects of methamphetamine abuse on the brain. So I was really delving deeply into that field. And then I had a death in my family, and my grandmother passed away. And I watched our family rabbi interact with my father and my aunt, who are the two children of this very old woman. I mean, my grandmother was 96 when she died. She'd been sick for about 6 years. This was not unexpected. This was not unwelcomed. We would have loved for her to live a long, healthy, happy life, but that's not what she had. And so there was some relief for her own peace that she had passed away. But I got to see this rabbi have two grown adults, my father and my aunt, sit in his office, and I was lucky to be able to be in that office with him. And they just melted. They just melted in front of this rabbi and shared so many amazing, wonderful stories, and they cried. And I was never used to seeing my father cry, that's for sure. He was a very strong. He was a physician and a businessman, so he really his emotions to himself. And so, seeing that just the presence of this person created this really incredible dynamic of storytelling and sharing, and the rabbi got to be part of the process of burying my grandmother, but also supporting my family during this time. It was like it really was an epiphany. I was like, that's what I'm looking for. That's it. What I wasn't finding in psychology and what I was searching for, which took me to neuropsychology and research studies on drug abuse, because I was really, a ship without a rudder at that point. I found there. So I started on that path, and that was a slow transition. I stayed in psychology, started teaching religious school, which I had no earthly reason to be teaching religious school because I knew nothing about it. I didn't have any Jewish studies background or any religious studies. I had philosophy in my college work, but I didn't have any religious studies in my college work. So it was a very slow process making my way. And actually, I was lucky that rabbinical school took me with such a small background, because I did much of my learning about really being a Jew, truthfully, while I was in rabbinical school, which was a strange experience to do, because for any of us who have been through seminary, will tell you, seminary is the wrong place to have a spiritual experience. It's not the place to go. So, but I made it through, and I really do have a blessed life, even in these crazy times. In fact, more so now than ever before, I find myself doing much more meaningful work while helping people process their frustrations, their fears, their hopes, their concern, processing the unknown. These are all great religious questions that theology has been grappling with for a long time. So being here in this moment, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, really allows me, and I think other clergy, to, if we're present and available, to make a difference in people's lives in a much deeper way. So exactly what I was looking for 11 years ago when I graduated rabbinical school, and 5 years or 6 years before that, has really, interestingly, or believe it or not, somewhat come to fruition in this very turbulent and difficult time.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would also be remiss if I didn't add that you also serve on GIPL's advisory council.
Yes, I do. It's one of the highlights of my job. I was so honored to be asked. What was it, 2 years ago?
Yeah,
I think, and that's been really meaningful. And the conversations that you and I have had, what GIPL does is really steps it up. I think most people, I don't know most people, that's probably an incorrect statement. I think a lot of people consider themselves environmentally conscious, and even more so would consider themselves to be environmentalists. And then you get into a GIPL meeting, or you get into a GIPL space, and you realize how much there is to know about real environmental politics and culture and work. And that's a lot of the conversations you and I have had, which then encouraged you to invite me to this place.
Absolutely.
Because what GIPL does is really hardcore work in this field. So I'm really honored to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wanted to ask you how, I know we asked you to be on the advisory council, and you've been doing that and been in that work. I wanted to ask how you kind of, just generally, how you got interested in the environment, or how that intersects with your own work as a rabbi. And I think you also maybe have another story that you want to share as well.
Sure. So it stems from home. My mother especially was an environmentalist and a real social activist on a lot of different ways, women's issues and women's rights, but the environment was a big part of it. I remember really early on, when I was very young, I had a story where my grandmother, my mother's mother, I guess I was spending the night at their house. I don't know why it was the case, but I was brushing my teeth. My grandmother was helping me brush my teeth. And my grandmother would turn on the water to start the toothbrushing, put the toothbrush with the toothpaste underneath the sink, and then start brushing her teeth, and had me start brushing my teeth with the water on. And I remember my mom coming in and saying to her mom, Mom, turn off the water. What are you doing? And she's all like, well, we're brushing our teeth. It's like, yeah, you're wasting so much water. And like that really stuck in my mind of the impact that one person could make, and also how conscious my mother was with all these things. She was recycling way before there was even recycling. I think it was in the day where we used to have to take our recycling to a facility somewhere and drop it off. Like, so I really owe my mom a lot. And I'm going to have to get a copy of this and send it to her, because I'm saying nice things about her. So that's kind of where it started. That then really sparked interest in the environment. And again, it was the same thing like that drove me to become a rabbi. I didn't just want to know and learn about the environment. I wanted to be part of the environment. I think that's one of the real things that the environmental work that GIPL does, and also my way into it, has really helped. So I want to be part of it. Like, I really wanted to see my place in the environment, and how I could be just struck with awe and wonder. So my first major in college was marine biology, and I failed miserably at it. I was a terrible student, and I failed marine biology my first semester in college. Just failed it, but I loved it. So that was really a disappointing thing. I loved this class, and I had so many memories, and I loved the field trips, and then I got an F. Just like, the teacher was just brutal, but I still loved it. But all through, even before then, I was interested in aquatic life, and I would go to, I born and raised in Los Angeles, and when I was younger, there was a place called Marine World, which now I know that these parks are not environmental, havens in any way, but there was that, and so I'd go there. Then there was SeaWorld, which was just down in San Diego. So I spent a lot of time, and then as I got a little older, like in middle school, I started to actually take the initiative and start. My parents would take me down to Scripps Institute in San Diego for lectures. And my parents would fall asleep as I was there taking copious notes. It was just like something I was really fascinated in. At a very young age, I learned how to scuba dive, and I really became very interested in coral reefs and things like that. So I definitely had this whole bend early on, and that's and of course, when you start to really become involved in environment, whatever it is, if you're a hiker or if you're a marine biologist or whatever, if you're doing it right, you start to see that not only is there awe and wonder, but that we are having such a detrimental impact in the environment you're in. So it didn't take long before I was mostly interested in sharks when I was studying marine biology, or I couldn't call it studying, but just looking at it and in awe of it. And it didn't take long, so you'd be studying some species, or you'd be studying some element of the aquatic world, and they'd say, these are these 12 different species of fish here, but most of them are extinct now because of human beings. And then over here's plant life, and here's kelp, but most of the kelp fields are extinct. Oh, by the way, kelp provides most of the oxygen for the world. Most of the oxygen comes out of the ocean, doesn't come from trees, comes out of the ocean. And by the way, that's mainly gone now as well because of man. And it's like, if you're listening, you start to say, I think we need to do some work here. I think something's going on. And so that really started me in that. So it was my mother interest in the environment. I'm a Pisces, by the way. I don't know if that's of relevance, but it is for my wife. She likes to remind me of that every time we clash. She reminds me that she's a Leo and I'm a Pisces. So
I'm also a Pisces, so I'll just that's why this conversation is working.
That's why we get along so well.
Yeah.
But so those are some of the things, and really being somebody who fell in love with the environment, and through that realized how bad I am for the environment.
Well, let me follow up on that and push us deeper into faith territory, and maybe ask, I think both, you've talked a little bit about water, you've talked about obviously species and environmental degradation by human beings, essentially. And so I'm curious how your faith as a Jewish leader kind of intersects with those things that you're feeling, those sort of natural concerns. Like, what's sort of some of the undergirding theological case for working in environmental justice?
So I think that it's the big shame in the theological conversation is our familiarity with Scripture. It's so prevalent, so people know the stories, and of course that's important, right, for educational purposes. But we know them so much that we never go back and revisit them and look at them a little bit more critically. We learn them when we're younger. We learn the story of Noah. We learn about the ark and the animals two by twos, or whether twosies, whatever the song goes, right? And we learn about the plagues in Egypt and all that. But what we don't get to do as often is really be able to compare that the Bible is an environmental text like no other, and it especially was in the time it was written. Because in the time in early Mesopotamian religions, of course they spoke about the environment. Environment was a big piece, but much of those texts were really treaties between the gods and human beings. And what the Bible laid out was a very different relationship for human beings in there. Whereas these ancient texts, Hittite texts or others, they often, at least the pieces that we have found, right, pieces that we know about, often focus on, that there is a God, a deity, or deities, right, and that we have a certain relationship, and our relationship is X, and they do play out very much like legal contracts. Whereas the Bible came around and started with a story. right? That was completely void of human beings. They didn't necessarily talk about human beings at first. It talked about water, and it talked about land, and then it talked about insects and plants and animals, and it started this, very slow rolling of creation. And like that's the beginning, rather than saying, like having a preamble where it describes, God is the God of all time, all power, majesty, will destroy anything that comes in its way, which of course many people have said, when they compare the Old Testament and what is called the New Testament, they like to compare those type of things. That might come later, but in the beginning, it was, number one, the deity was assumed, right? Completely assumed. And the focus of the story was about order within environments. And that's really important. And we forget that because we're too busy, making drawings of an ark, floating with an elephant hanging out the front, and for our kids' rooms. And we forget that there are these incredible, that the story begins in a very, very important way. There's a great Hasidic teaching that came much later on, which likes to remind people that the cockroach was created before human beings were. So before we get all uppity and try to, think of ourselves as the top on the food chain, that God thought about many, many other things before we were created. So we really need to remember our place. The Bible then goes on further. Of course, I've been, playfully bringing up the Noah story, but that it's the Noah story happens through a natural catastrophe, which, by the way, or a global catastrophe, which we know. We're in some of those, like right now, right? You go to the you get to Egypt, and you go to the plagues of Egypt, and many of them are environmental realities, by the way. There are still locust swarms throughout Egypt. Egypt and up through that Middle Eastern area. These are real realities, and that the Bible decided to speak of that. The nomadic journeys of the people Israel and the Hebrews, the early Hebrews, were all because of droughts and plagues and things like that. It wasn't because of. There were cases of warring tribes and kings and pharaohs that push people in and out of areas, but a lot of the movement of the Bible happens because of environmental issues. At what point do we admit that our Bible, our sacred texts, are really trying to say something really important about our environment and our relationship to the environment? If anything else, it's quite devoid of exactly what we owe to God, and more of what we owe to the environment and how we have to take care of the world. That's a really important point of it. Not to say that it doesn't talk about how we have to relate to God. It does.
Sure.
But so, it just goes on and on and on and on.
Well, that goes right into something that you and I talked a little bit about. And I think especially when you're talking about the Noah story and these sort of worldwide plagues and where we find ourselves in this sort of the midst of a worldwide catastrophe. I know that you've been thinking a lot about interconnectedness and how all of that is working, especially in light of COVID-19 for faith communities and for others. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, you asked earlier about a story that I could tell. So I thought a little bit about it, and there's a story that I wanted to share about the Tower of Babel. So the story of the Tower of Babel is really interesting because it's fairly well known. I think quite a few people know the story of mankind working together to create this tower that will reach the skies with the hope of communing with the divine or showing might over creation, or whatever you want to, however you want to interpret the story. And it's at that point that God looks down and says, this is no good, and scatters the people and confounds their language, right? Which is, I believe is where we get the word babble, that when you can't understand somebody, they're babbling, right? Because
right.
I believe it comes from that place. There's a great midrash that talks about the really insidiousness of that story. Because on the surface, that doesn't seem like a bad, everybody working together, they were all talking to one another. I'm missing the problem here that God saw. And a midrash comes to explain it and says that when human beings were building it, as it got taller and taller, of course, the construction project became more and more dangerous, right? You're climbing higher and higher up to put another brick on top, and people were falling, people were dying. And when somebody fell, nobody paid any attention. But when a brick fell, the Midrash says, everybody went into terrible mourning and loss about, oh, look how our project is being stalled, right? Because we lost a brick, right? Not that we lost a human being, they're expendable, but the bricks are. And I have to tell you that this time really feels a lot like that. Which are we mourning over? Are we mourning over the loss of life or the loss of income right now? Are we concerned about opening each other's hearts or opening up our economy? Which one are we doing at this moment? I'm not saying that the economy is not an important piece of it. The Tower of Babel would not have been built without bricks. However, when things start to fall off, we have to prioritize which things are precious when they fall from high heights, and which things are allowed to fall to the floor and we could pick them up later. And that's what that Midrash really speaks to me. And this moment is really a challenge, because I think we have a lot of voices in both camps of the Midrash, right? The camps that mourn the bricks falling and the camps that mourn the people falling. And that's a really big piece of it. And for me, that plays into environmental justice, and it plays into food justice and other things like that, because I think that we have become so in love with the project we're building, right? We've become so in love with our own greatness as human beings that we've lost all awe and wonder of the environment. The same thing that brought me into the love for the environment wasn't that I felt this great concern at first. It was that I had this awe and wonder. It was just amazing, right? The ocean, it's just incredible. And look at all these sea creatures, and they're so weird looking. And oh my gosh, it's just amazing, right? And you could go out into the forest, and it's like, wow, look at these trees. They just tower over us. And it's just such a strange thing, too, that these things are just sticking out of the ground, right? And that they started from, sort of from something the size of a pea, and they're now tower way above us. But we don't even notice those things anymore because we're too concerned with how fast our cars go, and our skyscrapers, and our internet connection, and all these things that we create. And it's a problem.
That Midrash interpretation of the story is very insightful. I mean, I think we know the story, and I think inherently assume like there's something prideful and idol worship about it, but it's not super clear what that is from the story itself. But that, I think, paints a really good picture as to how the ways in which we consume and what we prioritize is in fact idolatry. The way in which we dispose of the natural world and each other for the sake of a project or whatever else.
Sure.
It's actually that. Yeah. And this will go right in. We've talked about different policy issues before, and a lot of Kolash meetings that we've been in, and other kind of environmental justice issues. And while you're talking about this Babel piece, what do you think the role of a religious leader or rabbi like yourself is in light of these environmental issues? How kind of your role in and of itself, how do you see your role in light of those environmental issues? And then what do you see your role as educating and trying to equip your congregation to engage those issues?
That's a great question. That's a really difficult question. I could really only speak for myself.
Yeah.
Although I'm currently the president of the Atlanta Rabbinical Association, it really is more like herding cats than anything else, which is, so I think a lot of organizations think that I do speak for the community of rabbis. I really don't. All I try to do is try to get them to talk together, or at least in order, so that we could hear their voices. They all have a lot of different opinions and different ideas.
You're just playing moderator.
Exactly. That's really what I am. Yeah. I think that my first and foremost is I have to live the life that I encourage other people to live. A rabbi, the word rabbi just means teacher. That's really all I am. And so I teach not only through the wisdom that I accumulate and the classes that I put forward, but I also teach by the way I live my life. So that's the first step. So I think that the first step for religious leaders is that if they're going to be involved in environmental work, then they actually have to do it, right? If we're going to see that composting is worthwhile, then we have to compost. And if we're going to see that recycling is important and changing out our light bulbs, we have to do those things, and we have to use our influence in whatever way we can. And being religious leaders, we have influence not only of our own institution, of our own home, but then we have of our institutions. So making sure that our institutions are walking the walk, I think, is really, really important. So at AA Synagogue, we've really tried to do that, and we've been very lucky. As you know, we have some real great environmental heroes in our congregation who have helped bring composting to our synagogue, and recycling, and focus on solar power, and all these. So the first thing is to walk the walk. The second thing is to start chronicling, at least for yourself, the challenges in walking the walk. Because I think where a lot of pastors and religious leaders fail is that they come up from a kind of a theoretical basis, right? They peer into their text and they say, this is what the text wants us to do, but they don't realize that the text is speaking to us because we are a human being who needs to live it. And so if we can't live it, then we need to understand what are the components that are getting in or the challenges for it, and to help to articulate and validate some of those. So, composting is really quite difficult, right? It's not the easiest thing on earth. We have a composter in our backyard, and I'm scared of it. It's just gross, right? And I have a hard time touching it, right? So for a while, we stopped composting because it was really difficult. But then through the synagogue, we found a service that we could use, right? So now we use the service. I got composter out, and I'm paying however much a week. But those things are important to chronicle, right? And to then share your life experience. So one is walking the walk. The other is presenting the wisdom that is reasonable, right? What are the issues, and how do we live those things in a reasonable way that for our congregants. And then the third piece, I think, which is really important, is to really help people realize that it is part of their spiritual tradition. It's part of their spiritual path. Living a life that is in concert with the environment is a really important piece of all of our spiritual journeys. And there's a lot of overlap between the three of those, and I think understanding that overlap and being sensitive about it helps people along. I remember, and the last thing I'll say about this, I remember there's a rabbi in the world, not in this community. His name is Yitz Jacob. Not Yitz Jacob. Yitz Greenberg. Excuse me. Yitz Jacob is not a rabbi. Yitz Greenberg, who is I was at a lecture with him, and he was talking about what makes a successful rabbi in a community. And he said, a rabbi that is 15% more progressive, more environmentally conscious, more religious, more whatever than his community is a good rabbi. A rabbi that's 25% is unemployed, right? And so I think it's a funny little piece that he brought up, but it's a real thing, right? I have to know where my community is when it comes to the environment, and I have to work from where they are. Standing on for us the bima, but wherever you are, on the pulpit, right? And yelling at people and telling them that this is God's will and you've got to do this, got to do this. If you don't know where they're coming from and you don't offer real workable solutions for their life, then they're going to learn to tune you out. And unfortunately, I have inherited several generations now of rabbis who did not have that consciousness at all, and have acclimated my congregation to tuning out their spiritual leaders. And so it makes it even more difficult. So that's a really important piece, that your pastor needs to know what you're doing and how you're doing it, and then offer real solutions.
Yeah, I think that point is really good, that we can't charge ahead and leave everybody in the dust and then yell at them for it. Yeah. It is a communal journey that it doesn't do us very much good unless we can bring each other along in that same path.
And I have to tell you, and if another, shameful, shameless plug for Gitbull, one of the things I think you and Kate have been really fantastic about is, I should have terrible self-esteem about my congregation's environmental record, right? But you guys make us feel like you're doing it. Keep it up. You're doing fine. Keep it going. Okay, you can't do this. Okay, try this. Let's do this. Those are really important self-esteem boosters for us. Not enough to make us, you don't do it enough to make us feel like, oh, we're doing great. We could drop it all now. But you do it enough to make us say, no, we could achieve this, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and like we've talked about, I remember an early conversation with Kate, Reverend Kate, about, I have an old building. I have a really old building. It's going to cost hundreds, if not millions of dollars to get it where I want it to be, right? And I remember talking to Kate about that, and she was all like, okay, yeah, don't worry about that. Let's just get it here. Let's just change the light bulbs. Let's just, get a recycling program. Let's just little bit, Can I change out all the windows in the building? That's going to be hard for my congregation to do, right? But could I do something more efficient here? Could I run it low, the air conditioner at a lower temperature? Could I, like all these different things that can make a difference.
Right.
That's really meaningful.
And it's all about making those little changes, things that don't seem like they're very important or even that they're spiritual, in fact, are actually very spiritual in the way that the discipline of them.
Yeah. And I think that, it ties back to the earlier part of our conversation. My mom telling me, turn off the water when you brush your teeth. In between, the watering of your toothbrush and then the cleaning of your toothbrush, turn off the water. Is it a lot of water that we saved? No. But if everybody did it, and the fact that my mom does it and now I do it, did my grandma ever learn? Probably not, right? But, now it's 2 people. My mom influenced 2 people to do it.
Yeah.
And guess what? I have 4 kids. My wife and I have 4 kids. And now we have 6 people who are doing it. Look, it just jumped from 1 person, my mom, to 6 people who are doing it. That is a giant jump of water conservation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Meaningful. We could all do that.
I want to ask you a little bit about food. And
okay, right.
I realize that we could talk about this forever. So I want to talk about being kosher and how that has affected you and how that affects maybe your environmental ethic or the way that you think about our food systems. In particular, I know that when you were in California, you helped found the Zagler School of Rabbinical Studies Kashrut Institute. Is that correct? And
yes.
that had a lot to do with allowing participants to learn about the world of kosher, how that works. And then that is kind of those conversations. I know we've talked about it a little bit. And so if you talk about, I guess, why that's important to you in the lens of environment and how maybe just that aspect, that discipline affects maybe the way that you see your relationship with the environment or food systems.
Sure. No, it's a great question. So Kashrut begins first with the blessings that we say. Now, I want to be clear because I think there's a real misconception about kashrut. I always get people who say, so kosher is when like the rabbi goes and blesses the cereal or blesses the meat that's being good. No, it has nothing to do with that. There's actual ways that things that are separated out, things that shouldn't be with certain foods, the way that meat and other way meat is slaughtered and things like that. There's a very precise way of doing all these things. But when I say blessing, it's about my blessing, right? In Judaism, there's a blessing for everything, but it doesn't mean that you have to know an individual blessing for everything you do. Blessings are put in categories. So there's only about 5 or 7 different blessings for food. That's all you have to learn. You have to learn 5 to 7 blessings, and all food falls into their categories. And in fact, it's scaffolded in such a way that if you can't remember the blessing you're supposed to say, there's one catch-all that you just say and you're done. And these blessings, beginning, the most base blessing is Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh bidvaro. That blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who by God's word everything came into being. Everything was created. That's the most basic, and that covers all food no matter what, because of course everything came, according to our tradition, everything came into being from God's word, going all the way back to that creation story that we talked about earlier. Then they don't get much, truthfully, they don't get that much more difficult. difficult than that from there. The next one up, you could say for bread, and that just covers bread, right? And that's Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And what's really important about that is the beginning, of course, is the same as what you just heard the other one. Jewish blessings are really simple like that. The beginning's all the same. So you just work on getting those beginning 6 words and you're golden, right? Because then all you have to do is learn the last 2 or 4 or whatever they're at the end. The beginning, blessed are you, Lord of God, sovereign of the universe. And then the end, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, that literally means, and that's the blessing, like I said, we say over bread, means that who brought forth bread from the earth. Now that's a really interesting theological conversation that we could spend the rest of our time in 5 more podcasts.
We're already going to have another conversation, it seems.
I look forward to that. But that's really important. And the rest of the blessings follow suit, right? That we're thanking God for bringing bread from the earth. Now, as you probably know, and anybody who's done any cooking will know, bread doesn't come from the earth. It's not like an almond or an apple or something like that just falls from a tree. It's wheat grows, and then you have to do all this cultivation. And the answer to that is exactly. And what we're blessing every time we eat anything is we're blessing that we're thanking God, we're acknowledging God, and acknowledging the blessing that we have in being partnership with God. Because God brings wheat from the ground, we turn it into bread, and we have this amazing relationship with the earth through that way. When we drink wine it also has its own blessing that doesn't fall for anything else, which is also, again, very interesting. Same beginning, Borei Pri Hagafen is the end, who brought fruit from the vine. Now, what's amazing about that one is that you don't say that over grapes. Over grapes, you say who brought fruit from a tree, right? But the wine is very, very particular because the process that goes into it, right? And of course, wine's just very important, right?
It deserves its own blessing.
It deserves its own blessing. Maybe. People have a lot of good with it. And so that's the piece. And so Kashrut really begins there with an acknowledgement that we are in partnership with God in what we eat and how we get that food and what we do with that food. So that is the jumping off point for both how you have a spiritual life with your eating and then also how important your an environmental consciousness is when you are eating, right? You have to know what's in your food. Do you know how much rock is in the food we eat? It is crazy. Look up some of the names, some of those chemicals, and the sources of some of the chemicals that are in our food, whatever it is. When you can't pronounce that word that's on the label in the package, look it up. Wikipedia is your friend here, right? Look it up and find out where the source is. I can't tell you how much limestone and other stone is in our food. It's just crazy. Right? And those, by the way, that's kosher, by the way. You can eat as much rock as you want, right? And still be kosher. That's not what we're looking for, is make it into the kashrut world. The challenge, of course, comes with all the animal derivatives that come into our food. And that's a big, conversation. Our cheese is filled with meat, which is a big problem in the kashrut world.
Yeah.
There's milk in so much that we eat. It's gotten easier in the world that we live in now because of the heightened awareness of allergies. But that wasn't always the case. I mean, this whole allergy thing is brand new. Before, people just lived miserable lives or they died. That's the way you dealt with that's
allergies. Kind of all of human history. We just didn't deal with a bunch of stuff, and you were either miserable or you died.
Exactly. That's really it. So and then the last piece I'll say about this, the kashrut industry, the kashrut institute that I created, I don't think it's still around. I really created it at the kind of the tail end of my rabbinical school career because I felt that I did not get the education in the world of kashrut, in specifically supervising a facility, which is what I have to do now with my synagogue, supervise a facility to understand all the things I just talked to you about. And understanding who is our friend in that endeavor and who is not. The FDA is a great organization. It is understaffed, especially now. I mean, keep in mind when I made that institute, that was 2006, 7, and 8. right? Now, I forget it, right? Those institutions were understaffed. So facilities that you thought were being inspected for food quality and health, right, were only getting seen once a year, right? And this is stuff that the FDA came and told us. We brought them in to speak to us. But all that really started from my focus on my environmental things. A big issue for me, of course, because of my love for the ocean, became the focus on seafood and understanding the different agencies that are not kashrut agencies. They're not looking at kosher, but they are monitoring what is sustainable aquaculture and what is not. And because of my love for the ocean, that became a really important question for me. And I am, unfortunately, what that's meant is I've been a vegetarian for a long time. I used to be a pescatarian, and now because the more you go in, the more you investigate, the more you learn. I'm actually not a pescatarian anymore. I've taken myself out of that game as well. I took myself out of the meat eating game because of the exploration in kashrut, and I cannot imagine the way we process our food was God's will. I think that, again, this is the Tower of Babel, right? This is the Tower of Babel all over again. We've become so impressed with our ability to do things that we stopped asking the questions of should we do something and only asked the question of how do we do something. And so when it came to how do you feed 7 billion people on the world, how do you feed them all meat? We never asked the question, well, maybe we shouldn't feed them all meat, right? Or maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should think about how we're processing our food and how we're distributing it. We don't. We focus more on could we, how could we? And that's the Tower of Babel. That's where we're back to that story.
Well, we have so much to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to do a part 2. For those of you who are tuning in, we've got stuff about music and storytelling and your hunger project. We've got stuff definitely about Tikkun Olam that I want to talk about, but we will be here for much longer. I'm trying to abide by my rules and keep it to
perfect. That's great.
Try to keep it under 45 minutes. So I'm gonna start to close us, but I want to ask you. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
It's been a wealth of information. I want to ask you the same question that I've asked everybody and will ask everybody to close us out, which is the kind of 2 questions, but obviously related, which is 1, what are you missing the most in a COVID-19 world? And then 2, what are you clinging to that gives you hope right now?
So human interaction, I think, is, I am not isolated. Like I said earlier, I have 4 children. So, I could use a little isolation sometimes. I will tell you that. So that's not really my struggle. But I really miss being able to meet with people face to face. Zoom is great and these other technologies are great, but I really miss that piece. Challenges have been watching, 100,000 people die, and although we say things like, people die, 60,000 people die of the common cold every year, but guess what? That's coming too, right? That's on its way, right? So we're gonna have 60,000 people who die of that on top of the 100,000 we just lost. So it's like, those are the things I'm really struggling. The thing that I'm holding on to, which I will be honest, in the last couple of weeks, last 2 weeks, it's been a little bit more difficult to hold on to it. But the thing I'm holding on to is that there were some real challenges in our culture that there was no way to overcome them. The way we, ignoring vulnerable populations, vulnerable people, and not just talking about health. I'm not just talking about people who are, food insecure, financially insecure, other things like minorities, right? Things like that. And we have an opportunity to rewrite that conversation or to begin a new conversation. I'm holding on to that. It's diminished a little bit, but truth be told, we have the possibility of coming into a new future a little faster than we could have created it on our own because of this. And I'm really interested in how we could do that together. And I'm personally working on it within my congregation. People talk about getting back to normal. I have no interest in getting back to normal. I want to get to a new normal. This is not our new normal. Not only do I refuse to accept that, it's just not our new normal. Like, we're not going to admit that, right? It's just not going to be. But I'm looking forward to the normal that we create, rather than being passive and letting the future hit us and dealing with it. I'm really excited about the future we could create together. But these conversations are hard. We're not good at it necessarily in this country. And so it takes a lot of work, but this whole thing has shaken us up enough where we could start to question the narratives that we live by.
Yeah.
And make them different.
That's great. Well, I wanted to, normally I end with a quote or a poem or a psalm or something, and I had something planned. And
Please.
then I saw this great thing about hope in your email signature, this quote.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
A. Kesher. And I wondered if I could share that here, if that would be all right.
I would love that too. So this is just our religious school kids. These are actually our youngest kids. And we have a teacher named Erin Johnson who's amazing. And she documents what the kids do, and she sends us out. And I took this from her email of what a bunch of kids said.
This is pretty incredible. So I'll sign off with this. It says, hope is like a kaleidoscope because it makes regular things beautiful. Then we asked ourselves, how is hope like Play-Doh? Children said, hope is like Play-Doh because it is better when it is used, and it can make something become anything. And finally, using our light table, we asked ourselves, how is hope like light? Children decided hope is like light because hope helps us see everything. It helps us see what is there and what could be, and it makes things beautiful.
Those were kindergartners.
They're
Is that incredible?
They're on to something. Well, thank you again, Rabbi Lawrence, for coming on, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Same time, same place, Tuesdays at 10 o'clock. I'll be here next week with Dr. Bill Brown from Columbia Seminary, talking about some of these same intersections. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you then.